Great. So you know we're recording this. It's been given you notice. As a disclaimer for the recording, I did just want to say that the discussions that take place today regarding the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement or any other agreement or terms and conditions that we discuss today are designed and created solely for the agents of the Legends of Real Estate. We do strongly enforce keeping things within the brokerage. So if anybody pops onto this, please note that any discussions we have here today are specifically for the agents of the Legends of Real Estate. So thanks for being here. I think we may as well just jump right in. I'm going to bring up the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. Hopefully you are seeing the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement on your screens or on some format that you're using, and that you can see it okay. Can someone just confirm that they can see the buyer brokerage agreement for me, please?
I can see it.
I can see it.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, thank you. Hey, Nick, thanks for being here. So let's just jump right in. First, before we go in through this, we'll go through the sections and kind of make sure that we're comfortable with terminology and use. But please don't hesitate to stop me with questions. At the onset, does anyone have any specific questions we want to make sure that I go over or that we address as part of this discussion? I know this is new and different and fun, so. All right, well, as the questions pop up again, I will try and monitor the chat, but I can't always see the chat. So please, if you do have a question, please don't hesitate to call out and let me know so we can address it. This is the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, is the one that was released last Tuesday. It is the one that does incorporate a lot of the elements from the agreement that has been registered and that will take place and go into play as of August 17. The parties to this agreement are the consumer. I made a mistake in my email. I think I said customer. It is consumer that the individual is referred to at this point. And that consumer, we want to make sure that the agreement includes all the parties. So please make sure that you know who all is engaged or involved as the buyers of the transaction. So I would write all their names on this to ensure that you are as inclusive as possible. The broker is always the Legends of Real Estate, but feel free to add your name or the names of the agents in your team, or if you're working as a team or a partnership, it would be good to include your name and the name of any additional agents that will be working with these buyers. Please note that the agreement does allow the brokerage or broker, the Legends of Real Estate, to assign the contract to another agent. So if you skip somebody, it's okay. Or if you just put your name on there and then you go on vacation and you're having someone cover your business, you are all still covered. This is an exclusive right to work with and assist a consumer in locating and negotiating the acquisition of suitable real property as described below. And we go into the definition of acquire or acquisition, which will include any purchase, option, exchange, lease, or other acquisition. So after yesterday's call, we did get a question on, well, does this mean that I need to do this when I'm working with a buyer and they're interested in leasing? All the changes that we've been discussing that go into play on August 17th are all surrounding around residential. And as long as the lease is a residential lease, you would have to have a buyer agency agreement signed before showing any property to lease. So that is something that I think is important to clarify. Any questions on paragraph 1 that we want to clarify? All right, let's talk about the term. So this agreement will begin on the specific date and will terminate at 11:59 p.m. on a termination date. However, if consumer enters into an agreement to acquire real property or property that is pending on the termination date, this agreement will continue in effect until the transaction has closed or otherwise terminated. This means, just like a listing agreement, if you were working with someone and they go under contract, this agreement extends through the time of closing, even if the termination date occurs during the contract to closing period. Now, lots of discussions about term. What is an acceptable term? What should we use as a term? This is going to be really dependent upon your buyers. So the term that we're recommending is a 6-month term. However, we have had people say, look, how do I incorporate this into my process? I'm used to working with someone, showing them a property or two, and then sitting them down for the buyer consult once we know that we really want to work together. I get it. But remember, we're trying to protect you in this process as best as possible and accommodate your work process and workflow. Can this agreement be for one day? Absolutely. Can this agreement be for a specific property? We'll get to location. Absolutely. It can be for one property. You can use this to facilitate the process that you currently have in place. But one of the things that I think is very encouraging about the agreement and the way that this is coming together is that this is going to push or force us to sit down and talk to the consumer about what we do. So much of what we do is rarely shared with the consumer, and so much of the value that we bring is rarely enumerated with the consumer. So I think enhancing our buyer consultations is going to be very important, and focusing on value propositions is going to be very important. But this tool, because it's now a tool in your toolbox, this tool can be used to facilitate the process that you establish in creating that bond relationship and connection with a potential buyer. So can the term be one day? Yes. Not something I recommend, only because if it's just for one day, what did you show them during that day? How are you protecting yourself? Every moment of your time is valuable. Whatever decision you make on how this fits into your process and the policies that we set to help you are important, but please don't discount the fact that every moment of your time is valuable. So the term we're recommending is 6 months. As you get your flow set up for how you create these relationships with the consumer, the buyer specifically in this case, let's talk about how we can facilitate that and what makes sense for you. So term-wise, again, we're recommending 6 months. Anybody want to have a input on term or thing that they've thought of for term or question about term? All right. If I'm missing something again, please just come off of mute and let me know. Property itself. So the consumer is interested in acquiring real property as follows or as otherwise acceptable to the consumer. So here's the deal with that. The property type. We recommend a more general statement on your property type: residential, multifamily, single family, townhome, condo. A buyer can start with one property type in the residential arena and shift based on either affordability, amenities, location. So there are a variety of different factors that feed into what a buyer may end up purchasing. The property type should be fairly broad and general in statement. You can say residential, and that would cover anything under 4 units or less and 10 acres or less. So be more general in your property type after consulting or in consulting, especially if you're using this at the beginning of a buyer relationship. Be more general. Location, again, recommend a broader area. We know we've identified Northeast Florida, Jacksonville metro area. If there's a reason that you're refining the location to be very specific, because that's an agreement that you and that buyer have, that's feasible too. It can be very narrow or it can be broader. We're recommending broader because we cover 5, 6 counties. If you are comfortable going to those areas, of course, that's something that you can expand on. please do not really, we've been advised not to do something like Florida. Reason being that part of the code of ethics indicates staying in your lane, being responsible for what you know. If by chance you did Florida and then someone went to Miami and got another realtor and you wanted to try and enforce this, in most cases, the legal eyes would probably not see that as a benefit to someone who was looking in Miami since you're based in Northeast Florida. So think about it. It's been discussed. If I say Northeast Florida and now the person decides they want to go to Tampa and look, how do I get compensated? Well, there is a general comment section or an additional comment section in this agreement. You could say any areas of desire to the buyer outside of Northeast Florida will be discussed with broker and with the opportunity to create a referral, something like that, or referral opportunities outside of defined location to be on a consultation basis with broker. So you can still set it up so that you can potentially refer these individuals out to areas outside of the primary area that you're specializing in, focusing on, and developing with the buyer. Does that make sense? Does anybody have a comment regarding either of those, the property type or location, or question? Okay. Broker obligations. So this outlines what our obligations are. The broker assistance. Broker will use broker's professional knowledge and skills, discuss property requirement, and assist consumer in locating and viewing suitable properties, assist consumer in negotiating and closing any resulting transaction, cooperate with real estate licensees working with the owner, if any, to complete the transaction. That just means that they have to cooperate with you too. Neener. Anyway, hopefully, potentially the listing would be in MLS, which is the guarantee of cooperation. Other consumers, and let's kind of break this down. Consumer understands that the broker may work with other prospective consumers who want to acquire the same property as consumer. If broker submits offers by competing consumers, broker will notify consumer that a competing offer has been made, but will not disclose any of the offer's material terms or conditions. Consumer agrees that the broker may make competing consumers aware of the existence of any offer consumer makes, so long as broker does not reveal any material terms or conditions of the offer without consumer's prior written consent. Consumer understands that even if broker is compensated by an owner or a real estate licensee who is working with an owner, such compensation does not compromise the broker's duties to the consumer. So, how do you feel about that? If you're trying to figure out what this means, technically what this means is that we, the brokerage, or the broker, the Legends of Real Estate, if any of you are making offers on a property, if I'm making an offer on a property and I see Nick
Did Clark freeze or is it just me?
He definitely freezed,
I've
Okay.
lost him.
and now he's gone.
He says your name and he's gone, Nick. What did you do?
I don't know. Hope I'm not trolling.
God. Okay. I'll send him a message or something. Maybe he'll come back in.
So, Tony, are you going to take the lead now?
Sure. I'll do that. No, I gotta go. My main question is on the retainer thing. Cause
Yeah.
I have an upcoming buyer going like, what's that about? And so I don't know if we can just put 0 or if we have to do it for everybody the same way. So there's no discrimination, or if we can, if they're going to be like a pain in the butt, that we can start charging them more and we know that in advance, or, like what?
Right. I hope there's flexibility with it because I think we might scare some people away.
Yeah.
But
Like my
if you
people
need
aren't.
it to defend you,
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it keeps you from like the time I showed 55 houses to this couple who never bought, that could have gotten at least my gas money back.
right.
But like I have out of town buyers coming in next week that are only here to buy, and they will buy something before they leave. So it's like, why would I charge them a retainer fee? I know I'm getting business. But
Is the
Right.
retainer hey guys, this is Maggie. I'm new to Legends. Is the retainer, does that have to be held by the title company, or like do we hold
Uh,
on to it? How does that work?
it's a non-refundable retainer, so I imagine they just pay the brokerage, and then we'll get our percentage after they get their
It
percentage.
isn't it both though? I think there was a box that says it will or will not be.
I don't know.
Yeah, but that was the
That
question I had too, was like, where does the money be held? Is it going to Legends escrow? Because it's got to be somewhere. Can't be.
I would think I think it's with us since it's non-refundable. It's not like it's going to come back out later on or something and go towards something. It's a payment to us in a way. I don't know if when we earn it. I don't know when we actually receive it, but I think we take it before we get started. Like, hello, how are you? Where's my $500? And then we hand it off to Teresa to hold
Right.
until we're done. But I'd rather not charge some people anything but I guess you don't, unless you have a crystal ball, you don't know if they're going to be a pain in the butt later and want to drive all
Right.
over town.
Right.
So, did this happen yesterday? I missed the call, but it sounded like there was technical issues too.
I don't know. I wasn't there
Yes,
yesterday
it
myself.
was exactly the same. This is Sandy.
Hi,
Oh,
Sandy.
hey. Well, I see
Hey.
he's still recording this, so he's getting our conversation. He just figured it out later.
Well, do you guys think that we can say this retainer will be put towards your down payment?
It says it's not. I mean, it's like it's services provided by us and is in addition to any compensation.
So this Florida Realtors is different than the Par Bar, right?
No, Florida, they're the same thing.
They are the same thing.
Yes,
It's
the
weird
Florida Association of Realtors is the FAR bar. And how
because
about
like
that repair request thing where there's nowhere for the seller to sign or agree to anything? That was fun. I did 2 of those before we got this one sent back out. I had
yeah,
to
that's
just
cool.
cross out the buyer line and write seller so the seller had somewhere to sign.
So the ones that are in there now then are just the older ones. The one that we're going over is the updated version
Of what?
of the exclusive brokerage buyer agreement.
Oh, yeah. This is the one that was just released last week, I believe, that we're going to be using,
Okay.
but not until
Yeah,
August 17th. So,
because the old one definitely had the option for will or will not.
and I came a little bit late, but are we on the one that consent to transition to transaction broker? Because there isn't one that's just transaction broker, or am I on the wrong page?
I don't know. I've never seen the one that he's showing today. I have not seen this one yet.
Well, I mean, because this one, I don't see one for a transaction broker. I see one as a transition to transaction broker. And that doesn't, I mean, it's the end result's the same, but the how it starts out, I don't start out as a single agent. So,
Right.
but I guess maybe instead of having a third form or a fourth form. Let me
Well, let's talk about this little retainer thing then, because that's going to come up. And like you said, for people who maybe are more difficult, whatnot, but maybe that's where we say, okay, and this is like these services that I offer to my customers, like showings and, looking up the listings, calling the agents, pre-approving the whatever it is. How do you guys see that going as like, Oh, yeah. And then what do we put the amount as? Like how much we value ourselves that day?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know. Well, I
I
think
think
from
so.
from a discrimination process, I have a feeling they're going to tell us we have to be consistent with everyone, so that it's not like we are pinpointing a certain cultural group or charging something like that, or we could got in trouble for that. So it's probably going to be something we either do it the same for all of our customers, or I mean, that's where I don't even like it personally. I mean, our job is to drive people around. If we get screwed once in a while, that's rare. If we're screening our customers correctly, we shouldn't be getting screwed that often, if at all. But to charge someone for doing the basics up front, it's going to be very off-putting, and I don't know if everybody has to do that. There he is. Yay.
Well, I used to work for a broker, and all of his top agents that he coached would collect a $1,500, on a credit card before they'd take them out to see places. And I don't think that this contract we're looking at allows for digital payments, right?
Doesn't look like it. Clark, are you back? I see your picture.
I'm back.
Yay.
Yeah.
Well, it's been recording, so you can catch up on everything that we said beforehand. We skipped ahead a little bit for you.
Good. Thank you.
We got a lot of questions
So,
for you about the retainer when you get ready, when you get there.
you know what? It's probably let's just go through this and get questions out of the way, because if this keeps happening, I mean, the good thing is it dropped about the same place yesterday. So anyway, let's get people's questions out of the way. That's probably the most important thing. So on that section right there, what we were talking about in the broker obligations is according to legal, we do have an obligation to disclose to consumers when the brokerage has an offer or is writing an offer on more than one property. Big question is, how do we monitor that? There's currently no way for us to monitor that. I mean, you would have to register every single showing with us so that we could tell the other party that there's somebody else from the brokerage writing an offer on that property. So that one's going to be a little bit of a challenge that comes up. I'm guessing most of the questions come about on retainer. Or excuse me, on retainer and compensation. So where have you guys been in your discussion while I was away trying to find internet?
I was concerned about, I think a lot of us don't really like the idea of a retainer for a lot of reasons, but I'm assuming that we would have to be consistent with across the board with everybody that we did, so that we didn't get charged with any kind of discriminatory practices. But do we have to do that? I guess, because I don't know if it's mandatory or not. And if it is, then what amounts and things like that.
Yeah, no, retainers are not mandatory. I actually thought that the retainers would be coming out just based on the way that the settlement was constructed and based on the pushback that we had from the retainer that was in the previous NEFAR buyer brokerage agreement. But the retainer remains. You can charge a retainer. You're exactly right. There's so much about this piece that I believe opens us up to all sorts of fair housing items. So we as a brokerage will probably establish, should a retainer be requested, we would believe that it would probably be at just a certain amount. And then of course, and yes, it would be across the board. That would be the retainer. It would not be, if you're doing this, then it's a retainer of this amount. If you're doing this, it's a retainer of that amount. Unless it was extremely well quantified, which I don't know that we want to get into. But we'll look at what we would recommend on retainers. But yeah, we're not thinking retainers are a great way to go. They're applicable to commercial properties, but none of the agreements work with commercial properties. However, the example. Yep.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, the retainers, so like we could get somebody to write us a personal check and then put it in our drawer. Rip it up if it doesn't work. Like, how do they pay this?
No.
who is it made payable to? It's to Legends, right?
The retainers would be made payable to the Legends. They are non-refundable, so they would not remain in your drawer. The retainer would be deposited and paid at the split, at the current split. If the retainer would be credited, that would be up to you. I believe that we'll probably make the recommendation that retainers held will be credited at closing unless the closing doesn't occur. But there's a damages paragraph also. So
So is it safe to say at this time that we're basically just not going to do a retainer, and then maybe later on we'll have a company like stance on it, but to get started on this now, we just kind of put a fat zero in there?
right now, we're not recommending. You don't even have to fill it out. I mean, if you want to put a zero in there, that's great, but you don't even have to fill it out. Right now, our stance is that retainers, especially designed this way, that retainers are probably not in our best interest.
And historically speaking, this will probably get redone probably before the end of the year, and it'll probably be taken out anyway, right? It's just how many times are they going to redo this form? And like they're doing the listing agreements, the MLS, they just keep changing everything all the time. So it probably won't stay.
I would imagine this would stay like this for about 2 years and be on a rotation, just like the forms have been in the past.
Okay.
This has been accepted as it relates to the legal design of the settlement. So I would imagine that that's going to be, that's going to stay into play for probably, I would think, 1.5 to 2 years. But probably going to want to give it a chance to kind of go and see what happens.
So it's your advice right now though, so that as a brokerage, we're not agent A doing one thing, agent B doing another, and then we could get any fair housing stuff. Are we just basically just going to say we're just doing zero now for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, we're not recommending a retainer at this time. Right?
Okay.
And we put no parameters to retainer, so we're not recommending that you do a retainer. The tough part will be if someone hasn't been listening and runs out. I mean, that'll be the challenge. So I would like to hope that I can get some sort of policies and procedures out before August 15th. So at least there's something everybody can kind of get on the same page about. But you're right, Tony, I wouldn't recommend a retainer at this time. Anybody else want to throw in something on retainers? I will say a couple of people have said, there are processes that take a long time if you've got people coming from out of town and you're driving around and then they end up not coming with you. Should you get compensated? Well, there's a damages paragraph. Would that suffice? I don't know. If you're doing a retainer, again, what's the level? So I'm not thrilled that they kept it in, but now we have to just try and figure out how to make it fair for everybody. How about compensation?
But I
Go ahead,
apologize for
Tony.
being late, and so I didn't see the very top of the form. Is this the transition to transaction broker? Because there doesn't seem to be an actual just transaction broker version.
This is
Or
the
is this what we're
transaction
on?
broker version.
Okay, I only saw
This
one
is
that
the
said
transaction.
transition. So they're the
Okay,
same.
so you want to look. No, you want to look for the exclusive right or the exclusive broker agreement, exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. And next to it in parentheses, it'll say transaction broker. And I believe it's in paragraph, excuse me.
I just went into the print blank forms and select a form, typed in buyer, and saw what came up under the FAR brokerage relationship forms. And there's 3 exclusive buyer brokerage agreements, 1 no relationship, 1 single agent, 1 transition to transaction broker.
Scroll down to where it says FL.
FL.
You'll see the newest, you'll see the newest ones.
There you go. Bless your heart. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, those are the ones that you should be using. Thanks for bringing up the distinction in paragraph 12 of the buyer brokerage agreement, it will define the relationship. This one does define it as transaction broker. There is one for single agency. And there is one for non-rep too. I'm going to back up just slightly. We were talking about the broker obligations briefly, notifying all parties that there may be other individuals making offers on property. I think that if we have an open discussion during our buyer brokerage consultation, that we can state, you know, look, we're going to be out there. There are going to be other people out there. If we find a property, it'll be important that we analyze the effectiveness of the property, the use of the property, to determine whether or not we want to make an offer quickly, as other agents in our company may be working with people interested in the same property. I think we can probably cover ourselves best in that way. The consumer obligations, because this is exclusive right, so we're back on paragraph 5 for a minute. The exclusive right does mean that this is a relationship between the brokerage and the individual. So they do have an obligation to notify us if they've seen other properties or gone to other properties. They have an obligation at the first opportunity under A to advise an owner or real estate licensee that the consumer is working with and represented by exclusively by a broker. So they do have an obligation by signing this to make sure that everybody knows they're already contracted with you. Otherwise, they could be eating themselves into paying too. The one thing that has been brought up a couple of times is, how do we enforce this? You'll see there's a paragraph that talks about mediation and arbitration. If they sign this and then don't tell someone and go with someone, can we enforce this? Yes. If we kind of have to, and this is the part I think that's going to be a real mindset shift, is we have to approach this as if this were a listing with a buyer, that we're listing the buyer. So the expectation is that when the buyer signs this, they understand there's a commitment to make a payment to the brokerage, and that payment is what is listed in this document. So while we're going to do what we can to ensure that any credits come towards the buyer's obligation, the buyer has to understand that this is an agreement between themselves and the brokerage with you as their representative through the buying process. And that's a major mind shift, because oftentimes we've talked to our buyers about their closing costs and their down payment, and the closing costs have now potentially expanded. Compensation wise, so moving now over to paragraph 7, the broker's compensation is earned when, during the term of the agreement or any renewal or extension, the consumer or any person acting on behalf for or on behalf of the consumer contracts to acquire real property as specified in this agreement, or defaults on any contract to acquire property. So we could potentially get compensation if the buyer defaults, just like a listing agreement. You would be under A looking to use the second section. In other words, you'll see that there's a space for a dollar amount or a percentage, and it says select one, and then there's an or statement. The or statement leads to a dollar amount or a percentage plus a brokerage fee. So unless you're paying the brokerage fee on behalf of the buyer, you would be using that second section, and that would include that brokerage fee of $250. Questions on that?
Yeah. Is that the dollar amount? That's not the price of the property? That is our compensation to us regardless? How do we know that in advance? If so, it would almost have to be a percentage. If we just said 2.5, if we're dealing with it, I got a buyer's coming in next week, they're going to be over 500. So I know it's 2.5. I would just put that there though, because I don't know the actual price of the house that they're going to be buying.
Right, so the dollar amount would be if there's a flat fee compensation that you've agreed to with the buyer.
Okay.
So remember, all compensation is negotiable. So if you said to the buyer, Mr. Buyer, for my services, I charge 2.5% of the purchase price. And the buyer says, well, I'm not willing to pay 2.5% of the purchase price. I'll pay you a flat fee of $5,000. And you decide that that's sufficient, then it would be $5,000 and no percentage. So the price of the property is not written into paragraph 6A or 7A, excuse me. Does that make sense, Tony?
Yeah, totally. I was confused for a second, but thank you.
Yeah. No, I get it. We're trying to figure out what all these blanks are for. So if you have a buyer that is maybe investigating the market, like we have people who come in for job interviews and they go on tours and they think they're going to buy, but they get here and they decide to rent, I would recommend making sure that you fill out the lease section, paragraph 7B. It can be a flat fee or a percentage of a certain number of months rent. So back when I first started with hammers and chisels, it was not uncommon that when you brought a tenant to a property, that you were compensated a percentage of the first year's lease. So it would be, for example, 10% of 12 months rent. In looking at what's being offered currently for compensation, tenant placement, it seems to be much less. So it would be whatever you and the tenant decide based on what the company's guidelines are. With options, the good thing about an option, if it's an option to purchase and they're going to lease for a period of time, you get paid on both the lease and the sale. So that's what the three sections are. The fourth section on other or additional fees. Other would be the broker will be compensated for all types of acquisitions as if such acquisition were a purchase or exchange. Not sure what type of an other acquisition there would be, but if you run across an other acquisition, that would be identifying that you're still allowed to get compensated, or are you being compensated for additional fees? What other additional fees would you be compensated for?
I just have a question for you real fast. If in the example, like
Yeah.
say you had somebody come to town and you showed them 25 properties and then they decided
Right.
they're not coming to town. Under additional fees, could you do something like $25 per showing or something like that? So that that's just an idea of like some sort of recoup of your time and expenses.
It could be, but now you've just made a case for the retainer.
Okay, right. I just didn't know. It's like if we were saying like $25 per showing in the event no purchase is made during this time period or something. Yeah, I mean that's the idea for the
You could-
retainer, but at the same time, it's like
Yeah.
this would be more. I think it's less likely to have any kind of fair housing issue because it's action driven by the buyer and it has nothing to do with
Oh, I
them
don't
as who they
disagree.
are.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
and that's why I think that's a great idea on additional fees, or to put into, what is it, paragraph 13, I think it is, or 13 with other terms and conditions.
Okay.
Or you've just created another realm for how the retainer would be calculated, how the retainer would be arbitrarily calculated.
Okay.
Makes sense. And the good thing is it's causing us to think about all the different things that we do and the concern that, gosh, if I were to not get paid for all this that I'm doing, how does that set me up? So how do I protect myself? Any other comments or questions about compensation? Okay. Protection period. So the
Wait,
consumer
I
will
have,
be,
Clark, sorry, I have one.
yeah,
So if we're a listing agent, starting after August 17th, we're gonna need to see this
Right.
form from the buyer's agent, right?
No. Just like a listing agreement, you wouldn't be
Is that my
requesting this
internet
form
that's
from the,
bad?
is it mine again? Am I freezing up again?
No, I think
I
it was
see
mine,
Nick
Clark.
moving.
Yeah.
Well, you're around the corner, so hey, wouldn't be surprised. Um, so no, just like a listing agreement, this is not something that would be shared with another brokerage. So you wouldn't be requesting this from the broker. There would be no reason to request this from the broker.
Got it.
Yeah. So to flip to that side for just a second, if you're the listing agent, you've already negotiated your compensation with the seller. The seller's already negotiated what his or her compensation is going to be to you, the listing brokerage. He or she's also negotiated with you if and what they would like to pay at the onset of a listing to incentivize the buyer's brokerage or to assist with offsetting any costs that the buyer has committed to with a buyer brokerage. When an agent working with a buyer contacts a listing agent, the listing agent can identify what the seller has identified as their interest in offering to a buyer brokerage, anywhere from 0 on up. The initial discussion between the listing broker or the listing brokerage and the selling brokerage, let's say that that Bonnie calls me and asks what the compensation is. I said, well, the seller would be open to compensation up to 2.5% for the buyer's brokerage. And so Bonnie says, great. She constructs her offer. She writes under seller expenses. Buyer requests 2.5% to be paid to selling brokerage or to buyer's brokerage, and it includes the seller's brokerage to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement, memorializing that 2.5%, and submits that over to the listing agent as an offer. So that 2.5% is now a term or condition of the offer. So now the seller reviews the offer and says, well, the price, a little low, I want to up the price. I'm okay with the closing date. I'm okay with the closing costs, but I don't want to pay 2.5% anymore if I take this price. So I'm going to counter this, and I'm going to counter this offer. So we would now counter the offer with the price and a modification to the compensation agreement. So if even when the seller says at the onset, I would be willing to give 2.5% to the buyer's brokerage, it is something that can be negotiated during the transaction itself from the buyer to the seller. Make sense? So the only thing in stone as a
Wait, so,
listing
sorry,
broker.
Clark, just to make sure that I got that. What you're saying is, here we are in negotiations and represent the seller, and the buyer's agent comes in and says, here's our offer. And then we present it to the seller, who then, excuse me, who then says, okay, well, I'll take this offer, but I'm gonna give that buyer's agent a little less money because they didn't come in at full ask. That's like gonna be the new common.
Well, it could be, and it would not be the seller's, it would not be the buyer's brokerage. It would not be the seller saying, I'm gonna give the buyer's brokerage. It would be the seller, and it's just terminology. We got to start we got to watch our words again. The seller would say, the buyer is requesting this amount to their brokerage. I will give the buyer this amount for their brokerage. Or I will give the buyer nothing for their brokerage as part of their negotiation.
But in this case scenario, wouldn't the listing agent, when they do the agreement, that's between the brokerage and the seller from the seller to us as the listing brokerage. That's the compensation. If it's going to say like 6%, and then we're going to break that up into halves, possibly. I have to get used to the new listing agreement, so forgive me. But if they were to come back and say, okay, you didn't bring the offer price at this, so we're only going to offer this to the buyer side, that's not really the seller's decision, isn't it? And because they've already agreed to pay the listing brokerage 6%, and if they want to give less to the buy side because of that, they're still paying the listing brokerage the 6%. So to say, instead of giving the buy side 3, we're going to give them 2.5,
Yeah.
that doesn't really work out in the math, because it would still be, they're still being charged the same. Or am I just totally off base?
Mhm. Yeah.
You're a little off base.
Okay.
With the settlement, everything is separate. So when we take the listing, like for example, in the current listing agreement, there's paragraph 8 and paragraph 9. Paragraph 8 is the total compensation that the seller has committed to the listing brokerage. Paragraph 9 shows what we're giving. So in the current listing agreement, you are correct that the seller has committed to pay the listing brokerage a certain amount, and all parties have agreed to a different amount or a lesser amount of the total to the buyer's brokerage. When the new listing agreement comes out, and I don't know what it's going to look like, but the way that it will break out is, seller, here's what I do for you. This is what my fee is. 17% of the sales price. This is what my fee is, 17%. Now, seller, as part of this transaction, buyers will be coming to see your property. Those buyers already have agreements with other brokerages or potentially our brokerage to pay a certain amount for their services. Are you interested in assisting that buyer or incentivizing that buyer to come to your property by offsetting what they may be owing to their buyer brokerage? Seller, no, I'm not. Okay, 0. Seller, yeah, 1%. Okay, 1%. So the only commitment that the seller makes is the commitment to the listing brokerage. That's the full commitment they make, is to the listing brokerage. The buyer brokerage compensation, just like you'll see in all these documents, all compensation is negotiable. So we negotiated our 17% as a listing brokerage, and then the seller has indicated what their desire is to assist with the buyer brokerage. I think some sellers are going to say, look, I'm going to offer 0. We're already seeing it. And then let me see what the buyer brokerage or what the buyer requests of me as part of the terms and conditions of the offer they give me. So if they give me full price and they give me a good closing and they have a good loan type and they have some good money down and whatever other term and condition, they don't want a lot of personal property. Okay, I'll do, they're asking me, the buyer's asking the seller, me, the seller, to pay 2% of their buyer brokerage. Okay, I'll do that. So the seller will now evaluate their bottom line based on what may include assistance to the buyer's brokerage. So it'll become very separate.
Whole new mindset. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What did you say?
I said it's a whole new mindset.
What did you? It is. It is. And that's what I'm saying. The agreement itself is, where we use the agreement in our process, how we set up our process with buyers. All of you are relationship people. So you've done a good job of building relationships with either past customers, current customers. And so they just trust you. And we haven't had to have the discussion of, in addition to your down payment and closing costs, or it's really not addition to. Your down payment and your closing costs are X. Well, now your down payment and closing costs are X plus a percentage, or X plus a flat fee. And the buyer can negotiate that, just like the seller can negotiate what they're willing to pay you as the listing brokerage or listing agent on them for the brokerage. Yeah, mindset difference. Yep.
Okay, so
Good
if,
questions.
like, say for example, would they find their dream home and we have a setup with a buyer agreement, they'll pay us 2.5%. And then the seller isn't paying up to 2.5%, if anything, whatever. And
Right.
they don't want to pay, they want to try and renegotiate our price with us. We don't have to accept that, right? But if we don't accept it, what does that do to the transaction as far as them being able to purchase that property? And are we an obstacle in some way, shape, or form that could get in trouble for?
Could be.
Am I overthinking it?
No,
No.
you're not overthinking
No,
it. You're thinking about all the different angles. Bonnie, did you want to comment on that?
No, he's not overthinking it for sure.
Yeah.
It just
No,
seems like
you're not overthinking.
there's gonna be some tough conversations
Sure.
at some point. With, if you want this house, you're gonna have to pay me for it, kind of thing. And if you don't want this house because you're not going to pay me for this, it seems like that's got to be some sort of almost like FREC violation, that we're not providing a service because we're acting as an obstacle to their ability to purchase. And if they wanted to break our agreement and go with someone else who would do that, uh, how do we do that? I mean, is that what, that's another case for a retainer, I guess, is to say, okay, at least, well, we'll keep your retainer then if you're going to try and walk on us if we do that. But I'm sure it's managing more to the exception than the rule. But if it comes up, this is where I guess you and Audrey are going to get a lot more involved in our transactions on the day to day if we start changing terms that have already been established.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think it's wrong to try and think about the different scenarios. I think it's important because I think the questions will come up. I think in many cases, your buyers are going to be already trusting you to manage manage the transaction with them. So I think in many cases, they're probably going to be very open to whatever is necessary. However, I think you're getting into exactly what is being discussed. We'll credit you whatever a third party gives us. I mean, and now we can break off into discussions on bonuses or overages of the compensation that's being offered that was agreed to by the buyer and the brokerage if a seller is offering more than. So, I mean, that's a secondary discussion in this. But yeah, you're right. That's why we have to enter it saying, okay, buyer, when we make this commitment, this is a commitment to you to pay me. Now, can they terminate this? Yes, and that protection period is the next paragraph that we were going to talk about. There's a protection period. However, if they go and sign another exclusive agreement with another broker, just like a listing agreement, then the buyer brokerage agreement becomes null and void. So we wouldn't be able to collect on it. I think you did make just a case for why a retainer is important and always crediting the retainer at closing, if we get to closing, but then the amount has to be significant enough that you're compensated for either the number of showings or the time or whatever. That's why either a flat retainer or a specific retainer, or I mean, it has to be an arbitrary number defined, or I'm sorry, the number has to be defined arbitrarily. I shouldn't say arbitrary. It has to be defined by quantitative versus any other type of measure. But it's not, it is going to be the discussion. And part of the settlement, the design of the settlement, or the part of the case is that we're driving up costs, we're driving up prices because we're charging so much.
Mhm.
But we're already seeing buyers who say, well, I really want this house, their dream house, like Tony was saying, and now they can't get into their dream house because the closing costs are higher than they expected. And they come back to us and say, well, you need to cut your fee. I need to renegotiate my agreement with you.
Right.
And then we say, well, I mean, we're not going to negotiate agreement. So they say, well, what are my other options? We say, well, I don't know. I guess you could bump up the price to offset the cost. Or you could request additional funds as concessions and then pay the fee, and the money that you got from concessions will offset some of your closing costs. So then it becomes a shell game, which I don't know if that's a positive thing or not. So
It seems
I
like
mean,
it's
I think
turning
that's
us
in the right.
and it seems like it's turning us into those people that they said we were when we weren't. But
Thank
it's like
you.
it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now we're going to be like used car salesmen and lawyers or something, as far as on the scale of people accepting us. But okay.
May I make,
I mean, I think we.
I completely disagree, Tony, out of respect. Like, I don't know you, but I think that this opens the doors for way more conversation and transparency, right? And if we are all on the same page as a brokerage with how we do it, we'll have, we'll have each other.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I think transparency is a wonderful thing. I just this is just we're having to be more creative, which is not necessarily a problem, but we're not saying the truth ever. We're always saying the truth. It's just that now we might have to find different ways to get what we want, and I'm not going to use the word conniving because that's got a negative connotation to it. So does manipulation. But when you're starting to change line items in order to find money under a shell here, that type of thing, that it just seems like it's creating what they were trying to avoid us being, is what I'm saying. They can know everything. That has nothing to do with that. But we're just having to do a lot more negotiation. So it's going to mean the stronger people will survive, the weaker people will be cast off, quite frankly, not to be rude, but you're going to have to be able to have negotiation skills. That.
and know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a know what you're doing. Do you know that we have an agent in our company that went to lunch with two agents from another brokerage, and they were sitting talking about the forms, and the other two agents said, "What are you talking about?
Oh,
What do you mean new forms?"
I had
Yeah,
a driver
And this
the
was
other
only a
day
week.
yeah, that's not going to be unusual. I can say I talked to like 4 different ones who didn't know. What do you mean? Oh yeah, they're just new forms. And I go, you better get online and you better check them out.
And then I think everybody's favorite question they'll be receiving from listing agents soon is, so why 15 days? Why so much? Because I've already had that since been using the far bar. It could have said the 10 we're doing for 15, and they don't understand that it's all inclusive in the 15. So I'm having to explain all that to them because they want to know, why are we asking for so many extra days? So it's fun. It's fun. But I think I saw online one too. It's like, if we just take each other under each other's wings and be kind to each other while we're working through this, it's going to be a lot better, because I'm getting along great with the other agents, but I'm also having to educate them on the process, because where they're at didn't teach them nothing, and we have you. So it's like, yay. But
And thank you for that.
yeah. So we're going
I
to be
appreciate you
leading the
guys.
pack, as far as I think we are leading, as far as understanding what's happening. As confused as we are, I think we're still leading what a lot of the brokerages that are out there, as far as understanding what's happening.
Oh, I think you guys are amazing. I mean, you guys have all taken time to not only read through it, but participate, ask questions, make comments, bring up good suggestions. I mean, it's wonderful. But yeah, so, and I think those are the kinds of scenarios we need to talk about, because I think it puts us more on our A game. I think both you and Maggie are talking the same lines. If we understand and we have a solid foundation, we'll have a much stronger value proposition in our discussion with our buyers. So there's an understanding. Are there going to be tough decisions that we have to make? Most likely there are going to be, because I know that you're working for the best interest of your customer in this transaction, despite the fact as part of the transaction in transaction brokerage, you're working with your customer or with the customer to get to the end result. And so I know that all of you are vested in that. You're also vested in, I mean, let's be real, you're also invested in your business, and you deserve to be paid for what you do. And I'm hoping that this will continue to bring to light the value and the stamina that you have in these transactions.
Speaking of
I
value,
think it's
Clark,
important.
what do you think is a recommended retainer amount?
Mhm.
I've thought a lot about that. I range from 1,000 to 2,500 is where I've been kind of landing. I can justify 1,000, then I think, well, really, that's not enough when I consider, I may have to show on average 15 properties before they go under contract, writing contracts. If it falls apart, rewriting offers, taking them out again. If I figure that I have a value, if I put myself against an attorney who's charging $450 and I'm charging $200 an hour, what's my base hourly investment? And then I start getting up to $2,000 very easily. And then I start thinking, well, is $2,000 unattainable for an individual buying? Well, I don't know. They've got to do a home inspection. They may have other inspections they have to do. They've got to have a down payment. They've got to have. So is $2,500, in certain situations probably going to be excessive for maybe a first-time home buyer who's doing VA. So we're talking about all sorts of scenarios, and we'll be bringing those back probably to some of you to say, what do you think? It's rare that we set a policy without trying to talk to the agents in the brokerage. So I wish I had a number for you, Maggie, but those are the numbers I'm kind of coming up with that I can justify and don't feel like I'm being gouging or don't feel like I'm diminishing what we do.
So what are you going to say when the buyer calls and says, how much is your retainer fee?
What am I going to say, or what is an
Yes.
individual?
Yeah,
I mean,
because
if
he's
a
going to
buyer
say,
calls and says,
yeah, I'm brand X wants X amount. What do you want? That's what he's going to say to you.
if a buyer
I
calls
mean,
me and
is that
asks that,
going
I
to
would
become
say,
yeah, I'm sorry.
no, I think you're right. I think that's going to be a conversation. Could buyers now compete? Could buyers now select based on retainer fee?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Sad. That's sad.
I mean, I think I don't disagree, but I think that's where our sales techniques come in, and I think that's where we have to kind of try and say, well, person calling me, potential buyer, help me understand why you're asking this question. I'm sorry, Michelle?
No, my husband just came in the room. He was wondering what I was saying. Sorry.
All right. I think that's, we have to slow the roll. Well, I appreciate the question, but can you tell me what the purpose is of the question? I mean, you have a business. There's no reason you shouldn't protect what some of your business models are. So, tell me what the purpose of this is. Well, I'm calling different brokers and asking. Well, customarily, I don't share my compensation model unless I understand what the responsibilities are. So if you would like to get together and talk about it, that's fine. Otherwise, $500,000. I mean, that would be ridiculous, of course.
Are we allowed to give them options, like 2 options? One, you pay this full thing up front, or B, you pay this, and if you choose a place in 30 days, then I'll knock $1,000 off. For instance, my retainer fee is $2,500. And if we do this right and if we find what you're looking for within 30 days, I'm willing to knock $1,000 off of that. Are we allowed to do that?
Well, I mean, are you allowed? Right now, there are no rules. So I would want to vet that. And the only reason I would say I would want to vet that is if we're giving discounts, we need to make sure the discounts are across the board and well-defined. We want to watch for fair housing issues or fair housing opportunities, maybe is a better way to say it. Also, if we take a retainer, I think it would be better if we establish a guideline for the retainer, and then the retainer becomes credited at closing unless they don't close. Rather than discounting the retainer, I would rather state that the retainer becomes a credit at closing, and if they don't close, and we could put a timeline on it, if they don't close before the termination of the buyer agreement, the retainer becomes non-refundable, or the retainer is non-refundable as it is. But our willingness to give it back as part of the closing would be hopefully the incentive to maintain that connection.
Said that so nicely. Thank you.
Oh. Probably makes sense because I don't know if I could say it again. Anyway.
Are you recording this?
I think we are still recording. Good discussion around compensation. Is there anything anybody else wants to bring up? I appreciate all of your thoughts and comments on it. I love that. And we are looking to try and do something like a role playing. I know everybody hates the words role play. I don't know what else to call it, but where we try and help each other learn words, learn words that'll work for buyer compensation, or learn words that will work for processes or seller meetings too. The protection period, we are recommending 90 days on the protection period. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Did I miss somebody? Okay. So I'm sorry. Okay. With the protection period, we're recommending 90 days. I know it says at blank 30. If you put this up against the listing agreement was a year. It's already covered in here that if the individual goes out and signs with another brokerage, there's no compensation. But we would recommend 90 days just to protect yourself should the buyer go rogue for whatever reason, or a buyer and a seller or someone else try and do a end around and cut you out. Paragraph 9 of the conditional termination. This is the paragraph that deals with what we want to call damages. I've written damages into the highlighted version only as a definition of what would go in here, not as what you would write here. So the goal of writing the word damages here was to help you connect with what the damages paragraph says in the listing agreement. And that's really the purposes of the conditional termination, is to assist in protecting you in the work that you do, and to potentially have the opportunity to collect what we would identify as damages for the time, energy, and money spent to potentially not get to a closing for an individual. That makes sense. Anything we want to add? Okay. Dispute resolution. We are fortunate mediation is offered through our board. It is nominal or no fee for mediation. So if there were a concern over getting payment, that would be probably the first avenue that we would like to evaluate or work with, would be through mediation. But if you look at the Code of Ethics, Article 17, if you're looking at how disputes over monetary means are resolved, it's most often through something called arbitration. It can be done through interpleader, but in order for interpleader to work, the brokerage would back out. In other words, the brokerage would not be a part of the interpleader process, which wouldn't make sense if we're attempting to collect on a buyer brokerage compensation. So we would do mediation to see if we can come to some agreement with a third-party mediator, and all parties, brokerage, agent, buyer, and mediator. If we can't come to agreement, we can move to arbitration, which is a more formal means of dispute resolution, especially focused on monetary means. Then there's the assignment under paragraph 11, which allows us and allows you that if you're taking a break, need a break, maybe you need a break from the buyer, allows you to assign it to another individual and stay within the brokerage, and then obviously the agreement stays intact. Paragraph 12 does define the brokerage relationship. And at one time I did put both the highlighted version and the plain version in the chat box for you to download if you wanted to. Who knows if it still ended up there? Let me just write down everybody's name, and I can send these out, both of these out to you, just in case you weren't able to download them for whatever reason. Okay. Yes, I'm sorry, Tony.
I was gonna say, selfish question. Teams, when you're talking about being able to assign something to a different person? Like, say I have someone with me, but if I'm going on vacation next month and like Miko or Jinky covers me, do we need to change something in that? Or is it just kind of because we're a team, it's covered?
I would
Thank you, Bonnie.
recommend on the way.
Bonnie answered,
What?
but
Yeah, I said no. I said no. It's a team. Okay, Clark.
Yeah, I would just
I'm
recommend.
sorry, I'll shut up.
No, you go ahead, Bonnie. It's cool. I'm good with it.
I just didn't know, because in the case of
I
a
would-
team where people are registered with that team or whatever, if you have it with the team lead, does that cover the people because of a team lead? But if if a member of the team were to do it on their own, may not have the same same reciprocity to it. But that's what I'm asking.
Sure. Yeah. So what I would most likely do is under broker, I would put the Legends of Real Estate / or hyphen the Tony Gets You Home team. That would cover all of you.
Okay, cool. And should I have the team do that as well then?
Yes,
On
I would
theirs?
recommend
Okay.
that. Yeah,
Okay, cool.
I would recommend that
Right.
all teams first follow the same process. Yes, absolutely.
All
Would you
right,
agree,
I
Bonnie?
appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
I love you, Bonnie.
No, it's great.
Sorry.
Bonnie has such a wealth of experience and knowledge. I'm always learning from everybody. So all of you too. So I appreciate it. I can use all the help I can get from anywhere I can get it. Anyway, so the brokerage relationship is defined in this agreement as transaction brokerage. Other terms. Are there additional compensations, bonuses, any restrictions or exceptions? Oh man, remember the agreement is designed so that you cannot collect more than what has been defined in the agreement. So Tony, you mentioned earlier as it relates to our brokerage, you had mentioned 2.5% at over 600,000. I would probably put in 3%, because what if you found a home where the seller was offering 3%? You could not collect that. Can you waive a portion of the compensation? Yes, you can. Can this agreement be amended? Yes, it can. When should it be amended? Prior to contract or after contract? I would recommend prior to contract. Can the buyer still pay a portion of the compensation? Yes. So if the buyer has agreed to 3% and the seller is only offering 2.5%, and you make a pitch, or the buyer makes a pitch to the seller to pay the 3%, but the seller says no, is the buyer still on the line for the 3%, or for the differential between the two, between what the seller provided and what the buyer had agreed to in the agreement? Yes, they're still liable for it. Again, can we waive it? Yes, and I imagine that's how now that we've kind of seen how this plays out, we've been kind of waiting to see how the listing agreement plays out. But yeah, can money be waived? Sure, but we're still trying to maintain the integrity and value of what we do. So what would go in here? Could you just do for specific properties? Yeah, if you wrote on page 1 specific addresses, sure, it could be for specific addresses under location. Or if you say see paragraph 13 for all addresses, and you wanted to put 4 addresses in here, sure, you could do that. A limited brokerage agreement or buyer brokerage agreement, sure. Modifications. Consumer has read the agreement and understands its contents. This agreement cannot be changed except by written agreement signed by both parties. Electronic signatures will be acceptable and binding. Where would I make changes? Is there a modification? There is not a modification to the buyer brokerage agreement yet. Remember, we have 4 weeks. So what could be one? Possibly. Otherwise, where would I make the changes? You can do it right on the document itself. I know that's hard for me to say, but you can do it on the document itself. This statement will be in all documents that are being revised. The brokerage commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. The broker may receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed with consumer. However, the consumer agrees that the broker may receive, may not, forgot that word not, I subliminally pushed that word away. Broker may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to with consumer. However, consumer agrees that broker may receive separate compensation from owner of property for services rendered to owner by broker for which consumer will not be responsible. Question came up yesterday. Oh, great. This covers bonuses. No, the intent here is to allow the brokerage in a transaction brokerage relationship to be on both sides of the transaction. This is saying if I'm the listing broker, I can still work with the buyer broker. So in other words, that the brokerage listing the property can also be the brokerage representing the buyer. For clarification. So what do we think?
I'm thinking a whole new can of worms on a number of things. So it'll just be fun. Like during the discussions with the sellers are going to be fun as we sign up their listing.
Yeah.
Because that whole what if we do bring the buyer to our own listing, are they going to be less likely to want to pay us for the buy side? If we're technically working for them, why am I paying you for the buy side?
Well, remember that you've already made an agreement with the buyer. So they're
Okay, that's true.
I mean,
but then again, the buyer would say like, I don't want to pay it, so I need concession. And then you're going to, yeah, I mean, it's just, again, the exception, not the rule necessarily, but it's just going to be
Right.
fun.
Right. And, you know, I think it'll challenge us to communicate with our buyers to find out, are there ways, you know, if the buyer's made this commitment to pay you, which I hope they have because you work your asses off, and now the seller is saying, I'm not offering anything. I mean, obviously, to offset their closing costs, they can ask for assistance. If sellers are more open to concessions related to assistance, that's fine. And related to the kind of decoupling of buyer brokerage and seller brokerage compensation, if you are asking, and we're recommending this time, and we're getting clarification also from people much smarter than me, do we have to separate that concessions out, because concessions from compensation? And so far what's come down is yes. So if I'm saying, if the buyer that I'm working with is saying, I would like the seller to help me with closing costs and offset my buyer brokerage compensation, I have to discuss those. I have to identify those separately. So I would have to say, buyer requests 2% concessions towards buyers closing costs and 2% towards buyers brokerage. So that would have to be set out. However, they won't be separated in MLS. So when you're reporting the sale in MLS, you would be reporting the total lump sum as concessions.
Okay.
So you have a little crevasse there to try and jump over, because I think the assumption is if we're looking at closed transactions, and your CMAs are going to need to start to show concessions if they haven't already. So that little crevasse that we need to get over when we're doing CMAs and saying, oh, well, property A had concessions of $20,000 and property B had concessions of $3,000.
Wow.
Okay.
Good point.
Did the agent remember to include any buyer brokerage compensation and concessions? Did they pay any concession? Did they pay any buyer brokerage compensation? So I think it's we're gonna have to watch that in our CMAs, but also since we're not, our real MLS at this time is not offering concessions during listing, active, under contract, or pending. Concessions will appear only on closed properties.
Okay, if you say, and you write an offer and you say that the seller, asking the seller to pay 2% toward the buyer's brokerage and an additional $3,000 or $5,000 toward the buyer's closing costs, will that work then? Then there won't be a percentage, and then the compensation will only show the 2% though, right?
The
Which isn't a
concessions would
true
only
figure.
show 2%.
Yeah, the concession, yeah, the concession, excuse me, yeah, will only show us 2%, but that's not a true figure, is
Right.
it? Yeah, okay, all right, okay, I follow, I'm sorry, yeah, you're right.
No. You bring up a really good point, because whether the buyer, let's say I'm the buyer and I'm asking you, the agent, to communicate to the seller that I want assistance with closing costs and buyer brokerage compensation. Right now, we need to break that out so that the seller understands exactly what they're negotiating.
Right,
So I would like $5,000 towards closing costs and 2% towards buyer's brokerage compensation. So if they agree to that, then we go to closing. Now, when you report that, you would have to report the 2%, whatever the dollar amount is, and the $5,000, or put the two together based on dollar amount. Or since I haven't seen the concessions field, the post-closing concessions field yet, the post-closing concessions field may say dollar amount and percentage, or dollar amount only, or percentage only. I don't know.
I may have both, yeah, I may have both, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I have a question, a stupid question. Okay,
Never
am I
stupid.
correct? Am I correct that we are transaction brokers, or are we single agent?
We are transaction brokers.
Okay, so why do we need to, why on this form, can we not just scratch through this page about the converting from one to the other?
You may have the wrong document. There is
Okay, then I do,
exclusive
okay,
buyer.
okay.
There is an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement that is transaction brokerage. However, I think both of you and Tony have made a good point.
I did
It
the same
doesn't
thing.
state transaction brokerage at the top,
Okay.
so I see how it's easily confused.
Okay, I grabbed the wrong one then. Okay, all right, now I'm clear. Couldn't imagine why. All right,
Okay,
good,
thank
okay.
you. All right, anyone else?
Thank you so much for redoing this.
Oh, well, that's and we got dropped at the same point, so heck knows. Anyway, of course, so if you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me. If you want to get on either a phone call or a Zoom call one-on-one, don't hesitate to ask. I appreciate the time that you take. Please remember the conversations we've had today during this session are related to the agents of Legends of Real Estate only. So I think that's it. Anything else anybody wants to add?
Thank you, Clark. Everybody gone?
Thanks, you guys. So everybody's, I think, everybody good?
Muted, but
I'm gonna go-
but
Thanks.
thankful.
Bye-bye. Bye, Tony.
Thank you,
Bye.
Clark.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. All right,
Thank you.
I've